Hi, I'm Preston, and William Lowe and I are again here to talk about another subject on roadmap. And tonight we're going to talk about when you're taking on a new exercise or learning a new task, why you should trust the process that your brain goes through and allow it the opportunity to learn so that you can make more changes, more progress, or improvement in your stroke recovery. So, William, you got some thoughts on this and the different types of feedback that there are. So, why don't you start off with that?
Yeah, sure. So I just want to kick things off by talking about feedback and why this is so important to how your brain learns and how your brain recovers in your journey after stroke. So Ralph and I have talked extensively about how your brain learns after after you've had a stroke in previous roadmaps. So I just wanted to underline how important feedback is to your recovery after stroke, because it's really important as you go through your journey after stroke that you're always giving your brain an idea of whether or not it's doing an exercise or a movement correctly, because this can actually give your brain a sense that it's actually moving towards what you're trying to get back in your recovery after stroke, whether this be returning to walking for the very first time, or whether this be learning how to pick up an object such that your thumb doesn't collapse too much in or flex too much in so that you can't actually pick up the object that you're trying to pick up. So feedback is extremely important in that sense, because it can give your brain a chance to sort of correct itself and identify what needs to be fixed in order for your brain to actually become a lot better at performing a type of movement or performing an exercise. And after doing this, will hopefully translate to you able to see more improvements and changes in your recovery after stroke, as well as live a higher quality of life. So when it comes to feedback, there are actually two types of feedback which your brain learns from. And these two types of feedback are called intrinsic feedback and augmented feedback. So intrinsic feedback is basically the feedback which your brain receives on its own. So basically this is what your brain is able to see and actually process whenever you're doing a particular movement or task, whether this be being able to regain your sense of balance when you're walking, or when you're performing an exercise, and just basically the internal things which your brain is able to tell itself about whether or not it's able to do something correctly when it's performing a particular exercise which you're trying to do. And now, on the other hand, augmented feedback is another type of feedback, which is basically the feedback which you receive from an external source. So this might be feedback which you might receive from a therapist who is telling you whether or not you're doing something correctly or not correctly. Um, However, you won't always have a therapist around you to tell you whether or not you're doing something correctly or or not correctly. And studies have actually shown that if you can actually expose your brain and teach your brain how to process feedback internally, so that intrinsic feedback, this actually results in your brain being able to learn skills a lot quickly and also see more changes and improvements in your recovery after stroke. So in other words, basically giving your brain more opportunities to identify errors in the way that it's performing a movement or doing an exercise, it actually gives your brain a better opportunity to learn, because it learns how to regulate the signals which it needs to regulate in order to perform a movement or a task at a more optimal level. And it also gives it a sense that and it also gives your brain a sense of the types of steps and the types of things which it needs to do leading up to a movement in order to make sure that it's actually able to get the most successful outcome possible. So for example, this might be being able to go upstairs in such a way that you don't lose your sense of balance when you reach, when you when you drop that first foot, and so on and so forth. Just to name one example. But basically, being able to expose your brain to errors in the way that it's performing a movement is important, because it's going to give your brain a really good opportunity to learn how to correct itself, so that it's able to refine the way that it does things until it gets things to a level where you were able to perform them before you actually had your stroke. So Ralph and I were actually talking about this earlier, and Ralph, I know you had a little bit of an experience with learning to trust your brain to learn a particular movement or task which you were trying to aim towards. And although you started off a little bit shaky and you weren't able to do the task which you were trying to achieve, over a long period of time, your brain eventually learned that it had to do things a certain way in order to actually get a successful outcome, which was the one which you were looking for. I was just wondering if you were open to sharing that experience, so that we could shed more light on this idea of giving your brain more feedback to help it learn and see more changes and improvements in your recovery after stroke.
Sure. Yeah, well, that example would be the compost lid. I'll get back to that. I went to physical therapy and occupational therapy, and I got augmented feedback from my therapist, and of course I listened to it, but I did a lot of my recovery at home. And in fact, when my insurance ran out, it was some months before I could qualify again, and during that time I did so much at home, I decided I was doing okay on my own, and I never went back. So the whole intrinsic side became real important to me, because that was the only feedback I got. I'm a very visual person, so I typically did that by observing what I was doing and trying to figure out what I was doing wrong. Sometimes that would involve my other side, taking a look and see what my other hand or arm or leg was doing, and try and notice the difference and emulate what, with the affected side, what the good side was able to do. So recently, I was making lunch, and I have an organic garden, so I I compost all the kitchen scraps. And I'd cut something. I'm left affected. I typically hold stuff with my left and cut it with my right. Set the knife down, reached over, popped the lid with my thumb and my unaffected hand through the whatever it was I was cutting, whatever was left in there, and snapped the lid down. I went, wow, cool. I just did that with one hand, opened it and closed it. So I said, I wonder if I can do that with my left hand. So I tried it, and it didn't take me very long to get the unsnapping motion down. And whenever I didn't like sit there and practice it. I did it every day at lunch for a while. I didn't do it like 20 times and set it up like an exercise or anything. I guess the first day I popped the lid a few times until I kind of got that motion down. And I noticed pretty quickly that I couldn't press the lid back down and have it seal all the way around with my affected hand, and I could fairly easily do it with my unaffected hand. So I started watching the difference, and there were two things. I tended to spread my unaffected hand. I wasn't spreading my hand big enough. So one of the first things was to get that hand big and cover the whole lid. And the other thing that I discovered was that when I opened it, I kind of bent it a little bit more with my unaffected side. When I opened it with my affected side, I kind of popped the lid and let the whole lid come up rather than bending it slightly. So I started bending it slightly and emulating what I was able to do with my unaffected side, and I don't know, took a week or two, couple weeks of tossing stuff in there every day until I could open it with my affected hand, throw something in, and close it back. So, like a lot of things, we've talked about breaking things down. It's kind of a version of that. Seeing what you're doing differently, breaking it down into smaller pieces, analyzing what's going on, and trying to put it back together right. And as we've talked about this before, the closer you can get to doing it right. That's one reason why it's important to kind of like trust your brain, and especially if it's on a roll, because the closer you can get it to being right, then you're going to teach your brain how to do it the right way rather than develop a bad habit, which I have found to be difficult to get rid of. So that's the compost lid story. I did it with any number of things. I think it's real important to pay attention to what you do and see what's working, see what's not working. I do a lot of it visually. So I think you had an example as well, didn't you, William?
Yeah, I do. First I want to say, like, 100% agree with everything you said. We're paying attention with how you do something, because that really underlines and emphasizes the importance of intrinsic feedback. Obviously, you're a visual learner, so that's how you process and that's how you learn things best, and that's how you understand how to actually do things. Obviously, every stroke club is going to be different in the way that they learn and process things. Whether it's someone who learns by just diving straight in and just doing it straight away, or someone who is like yourself, is a visual learner and has to see a demonstration first and sort of put the pieces together to really understand it from that standpoint. I just wanted to say that, that is really important. And obviously, through that intrinsic feedback and having a look at how you did it with your unaffected side, that you were able to put the pieces together and allow your brain the opportunity to learn what it needs to do with the affected side, so that you could get the same successful outcome that you were getting with your unaffected side.
A lot of times I find it's like your unaffected side just does things like automatically, and after a stroke, I knew what the motion was, slipping it up and everything, but it didn't. You don't tend to think about the subtleties of bending it and not lifting the lid all the way off, so you don't have to push it all the way down, all the way around again, and having that hand be big so you make more contact when you do push down. I find a lot of those subtleties get lost in when you have a stroke and when you try and figure things out, because I guess you're just going for like the basics of even trying to be able to do it, let alone the intricacies and subtleties that your brain does, like on your unaffected side, and like it did on both sides before we had strokes. So
Yeah, that's right. I think it really does come down to really finding those fine details and really teaching your brain how to regulate the way that it sends signals before you actually had a stroke, and getting as close as possible to being able to do that. Because, as we mentioned before in previous roadmaps, your brain does have its own agenda. And this is obviously autopilot and just doing things the easy way. But obviously, if you can educate your brain and really police it to do things as close as possible to before your stroke, not only are you going to see more improvements in your recovery, but you're also going to be living a higher quality of life, because how you educate your brain to do something after stroke is essentially how you're going to be doing that movement for the rest of your life. And on that note, I just want to share an example, just to really illustrate this. So one of the exercises which I came with a long time ago was this exercise, which you could use to help, which you could help to teach your brain how to regulate the amount of signals which it needs to send in order to turn over your hand as well as turn it over. In other words, pronation and supination. And both of these moments are really important when it comes to your ability to use your hand, because it actually allows your brain to position and orient your wrist and your forearm in such a way that allows you to to access more finger movements. So one of the exercises I came with a while back was this idea of putting chickpeas in a cup, like so, and actually giving yourself a challenge to actually pour these chickpeas, pour these chickpeas out. Now, usually it would be very easy to put chickpeas into a cup and just pour them down like so, and just tell yourself that you've done that task correctly and give yourself a pat on the back that you've done it right because you can pronate and you can supinate. But if you can go to a higher level and you can, rather than pouring out all the chickpeas at once, you can give yourself a challenge to pour out just one chickpea at once without 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 getting into a situation where you're allowing your brain to pour all chickpeas out. Then that's actually really powerful because you can actually teach your brain that fine control and that higher level of motor learning, which it really requires in order to achieve the highest performance of that particular task. So obviously, as you can imagine, if you're putting chickpeas or marbles, whatever you like, into a cup like so, and you're challenging your brain to have that fine control in order to stop itself from pouring all the chickpeas out at once, but just pouring out one or two at once, then it can actually really condition your brain to really pay attention to what it's doing. And it can also teach your brain how to regulate those signals in such a way that it used to before you had your stroke, and really, I guess, access those higher motor level functions which it used to have access to before you actually had a stroke. And that's just one of the many examples of 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 ways you could tweak an exercise so that you're really giving your brain the opportunity to make errors and correct itself, and giving itself that intrinsic feedback of whether or not it's doing something correctly, so that it's able to learn how to fire those signals like it used to before you had the stroke, and really allow yourself to see more changes and improvements in your recovery, because your brain does have that incentive with the added challenge to actually want to work a lot harder to become a lot better at that task, such as the one with the chickpeas or the marbles or the compost lid, as Ralph mentioned. And obviously after a ton of trial and error, like Ralph mentioned, he was able to eventually get to a place where he was able to close the compost lid with his affected side, which was very close to how he did it with the unaffected side at the same time. So I'm just curious, after listening to that, Ralph, I was just wondering, did you have anything else to add onto that?
Well, this whole idea of, we've talked about it before, getting back to natural, not overthinking it, not doing that cognitive overlay. So what I do once I get something like, say, the compost lid, because we're talking about that. So now when I'm making lunch or whatever, and I have something to throw away, whatever hand it's in, doesn't matter. I know I can open it with both hands, so I just go for whatever's natural rather than shifting stuff from one hand to another so that I can do it with a preferred hand. So the secret there is just kind of go for it and not think about it too much, because you'll get into that whole overthinking thing. So I don't really care at this point whether I open it with my right and stuff it with something in my affected left hand, or open it with my left and stuff it with something right. I tend to do that. I did that with stuff like putting the pitcher back and putting things, getting them up and down in the cabinets. You open the cabinet with this door, well, you grab it with this. If you open the cabinet this way with this door, well, you're going to grab them that way. Trying to make it be natural. So I actually, now when I'm doing that, I try and not overthink it and just go with whatever hand. I actually practice some of this stuff, like coming up my back steps. For a while there, when I got to where it didn't matter which foot I led with, I knew I never thought about it pre-stroke. So what I did was I walked up and I just took it whichever way, whatever. I didn't take any little half steps. However, I walked up to it, whether it was right or left going to go up in that first step, that's that's why I did it. Trying to get back to not thinking about it. Actually, when I come into the store now, there's two little steps, and I don't think about which foot I'm leading with. I finally got rid of that overlay by kind of practicing it, but you kind of can't practice it like in your brain to as a thought too much, because then you'll end up overthinking it. So it's interesting. So I always try, once I master a task, to see if I can get back to doing it more naturally, more like the way I did it pre-stroke, more like the way I did it pre-stroke was I didn't think about it, I just did it. Uh, it's such a blessing that people don't realize that they have. People who haven't had a stroke don't realize that they just do things automatically, and that would be so cool to be able to do that again. Anyway, so those are my other thoughts on taking one step further and trying to just kind of integrate it into your life. Okay, well, I'm chopping stuff up, I'm cleaning it up, just open it with whatever hands is free and stuff the stuff in with the other hand. So I don't intentionally try and open it with my left hand because I know I can do it with either. I just kind of gotten back to like just dump it, put the stuff in there, however it's easiest.
Yeah, that's right, and I agree. I think in the early stages of learning something, there is going to be a lot. Your brain is going to have to go through a ton of trial and error, and you're going to have to make some, and it's guaranteed that you're going to make some errors. But I think these errors are actually good for your brain because it allows your brain to learn that intrinsic feedback it needs to actually learn how to correct itself, so that it can actually become a lot better at doing that task until your brain gets to a place where Ralph is at now, where he doesn't have to think about how he's doing something because it just becomes automatic, and that blueprint is already created in the brain, where your brain already knows the sequence of steps which it needs to go through, like a checklist, in order to do something successfully. And this all comes back to the initial stages of actually learning how to do something when you're exposing your brain to that intrinsic feedback, when your brain is processing how it's doing a task, learning how to self-correct itself so that it can slowly refine the way it does something until you get to that place where you don't have to think about it. And it just becomes automatic because you've just done it so many times before.
Okay. Well, I don't have anything else. You have anything else? Otherwise, we'll close.
Not really. I think the main takeaway, and I mean, for all of you watching this right now, is, I think just Ralph and I would just encourage you all to really be cognizant of the way that you're doing exercise, and don't get disheartened if maybe you're doing something and it's not perfect the first time, because it's never, when you're learning a task for the very first time, or when you're doing an exercise for the very first time, it's never going to be perfect. It might be a little bit sloppy at first, but being able to make mistakes at the start, it is part of the process of how your brain learns. And it is very much like when babies learn new skills. Obviously, when they get a coloring book, when they first learn how to color, they're not coloring between the lines, but over time, as they learn the ability to control the crayon or the coloring pencil, then that skill becomes a lot more refined, and they're able to eventually get to the goal of coloring in between the lines and performing that task called coloring quite well. And this relates quite well to stroke, is that it is going to be quite difficult at the beginning, and you might have to overthink things, but giving your brain the opportunity to make these errors, whether through overthinking or just not having enough of a movement which you require, these are actually important because it gives your brain that intrinsic feedback it needs in order to actually correct itself to become a lot better at that movement, so that you can actually see more changes in your recovery after stroke and live a higher quality of life, because you know how you have to do something in order to get get the successful outcome you're looking for, whether this be being able to maintain your sense of balance when you're going up and down stairs, and what type of things you need to think about or don't have to think about because it's become automatic after you've practiced this so many times during the early stages of that task when you were making errors.
Right. Well, it certainly works on more complicated and more important tasks than opening the compost lid with your affected hand only. But so anyway, I guess we'll sign off now, and we'll see everybody on the next roadmap.